Hi, I'm Beth Howard, Director of Younger Lagoon Reserve, here to tell you a bit about the history of restoration at Younger Lagoon Reserve. Younger Lagoon Reserve is made up of two parts. The original 25-acre reserve located on the west side of the UC Santa Cruz Coastal Science Campus, and the Terrace Lands, 47 acres located on the east side of the campus. Before I talk with you about restoration efforts happening today, I want to tell you a little bit more about land use on our site going back in time. The first human occupants of the site were here about 10,000 years ago, and the Ohlone people were on the site about 3,000 years ago on. We know that native people cared for the land using techniques like burning of grasslands, thinning or pruning back of plants that they thought were undesirable, and selective planting of desired plants as well. The Portola and Cabrillo expeditions came through our site. This shows the route of the Portola expedition from 1769. The Portola expedition brought not only people to the site, but new plants and animals, including non-native invasive weeds that we still work on today. The Portola expedition had cattle and horses, and you can imagine that weed seeds came along, and the feed for those cattle and horses could have been in clothing or on saddles, gear that the Portola expedition brought. This is a map from 1859 during the Mexican period, and I know it's a little hard to see what is going on with this photo, but it's a picture of a hand-drawn map that shows different land use and habitat types in 1859 along our coast. It shows different watersheds moving up the coast. It's not really to scale, but it's cool. They're labeled in there. You can see Baldwin, Majors, all the different creeks. And then it shows places that were forested, places that were open grassland used for grazing, places that were cropped, and places that were left more natural. If you move into the 1920s, you can see that the Union Pacific Railroad has already come through the top of the site. So that white boundary is showing the boundary of Younger Lagoon Reserve and the Coastal Science Campus. And also, really interesting to me, you can see how much agricultural use of their site that there was already in the 20s. This is a site with a lot of human use dating back for a long, long time. Moving forward into the 70s, you can see that the area around the lagoon was even more intensively used for agriculture. At that time, coastal dependent crops, things like Brussels sprouts, artichokes, the things we see growing on the coast today were grown at that time as well. If you move into the 80s, you can see the area around the lagoon is a little more natural and that the original Long Marine Lab has been built. The farmer that owned the property adjacent to the Marine Lab still owns that property, donated the property of the original Younger Lagoon Reserve and the original Long Marine Lab to the university in the 70s. That family wanted for the lagoon to be protected primarily as a sanctuary for birds, and then also wanted to support the construction of the Long Marine Lab. You can see here the Long Marine Lab, it's those original Long Marine Lab, those low-lying buildings and the seawater pools that are used for marine mammal research. Moving forward, this is an aerial shot going back to 2017, so pretty recent. If you've been on the site, you know that this shot shows some of the construction that was happening in 2017, the building of our coastal biology building. That's been completed. All the road and trail improvements have been completed with that project, but that's pretty much what it looks like today. Restoration takes place both on the original reserve and on the terrace lands, although what's driving those restoration efforts and the history of those efforts is different. And I'll talk to you a little bit more about that during my presentation today. The original Younger Lagoon Reserve restoration efforts began in 1986 when the reserve was incorporated into the reserve system and continued up until about 2010. We still do work in the original Younger Lagoon Reserve, but that restoration work is really incorporated into our larger restoration efforts across the entire reserve. Original efforts included lots of weed work. So you can see on the left-hand side of the screen, there's some students working on removing poison hemlock, getting the site ready for more weed work and planting in the future. Poison hemlock, it's one of the weeds we have at the reserve. It's an agriculturally associated weed. It's a European weed, probably brought with the Portola expedition. It likes wet, disturbed soil, so a tilled site on the coast is perfect habitat for poison hemlock, and it outcompetes native plants. Once the weed work was done or on the site, or at least once the weed work was underway, weed work is really never done, we started to come in and plant native plants. So that involved collecting local seeds and cuttings, growing plants, and then planting them on the site. At that time, our program was pretty small. We grew maybe 5 to 10,000 plants a year. And you can see one of the techniques that we used in the early days was using these compostable coffee cups with the bottoms cut out of them as a protective sleeve around our plantings. So in those cups, if you could look down inside, you would see a little seedling, a native seedling growing in there. That technique is something that you see in forest restoration and vineyard production. Here the idea was to help keep mulch off of the plants, help keep mulch from smothering plants, maybe give a little bit of protection from wind, from herbivory, and try to keep some of the irrigation water on the plants. Over time, I became less convinced that it was really worth it to be cutting the bottoms out of all those cups and spending money on it. And even though they're compostable, boy, they took a long time to break down. And so we've moved away from using those types of protective sleeves. And now if we need to protect a plant from herbivory, we'll use something like chicken wire around the plant, or even chicken wire fencing over larger areas. Restoration on the terrace lands really began in earnest in about 2010 and continues till today. Same thing, we do all of our own seed collection, collecting seeds and cuttings from the coast, grow the plants in the greenhouse, plant the plants out on site, except our program has grown now from about 5 to 10,000 plants a year to 25 to 40,000 plants a year. Lots of weed work, students involved in all of those efforts. I'll tell you more about the Terrace Lands Restoration, and you'll get to know a lot more about it this quarter. But one of the things to know about why we're doing the work on the terrace lands has to do with the California Coastal Act of 1972. We're really fortunate in California. We have the California Coastal Act, which both protects our coast and allows for public access. The history of the Coastal Act is interesting. So in the 70s on the east coast of the US, there were folks who were buying up pieces of coastal property and then preventing public access, or saying, I own this property, it's mine, and you can't come through it to get to the beach. Voters in California looked at that and said, hey, wait a minute, we don't want that to happen in California. We really value letting the coast be accessible for all. So the California Coastal Act was passed through the voter initiative process. So, you know, the initiatives that come up on the ballot that are super hard to read through sometimes, and sometimes it feels like, man, can't the legislature just be making the laws? Well, the California Coastal Act came through the initiative process, and it basically said that the coast would be accessible for all and should be protected. A couple of things that it did is the California Coastal Act created the California Coastal Zone. That's the area that the Coastal Act would be effective, and also created the California Coastal Commission to help enforce and administer the Coastal Act. The California Coastal Zone, it runs up and down our state, and it's usually about 5 miles inland out to the coast. But where exactly that line is on the map depends county by county, and it's a human-drawn line on a map. So here in Santa Cruz County, this is a map showing our county, and then it shows both the fault zones and the coastal zones of California. I'm not quite sure why the county puts both of those zones on a map, maybe because they're both called zone. The fault zones are in orange and yellow, and you can, for our purposes today, you can kind of ignore those, but just look at the blue hashed area. That's the California Coastal Zone. So in the north part of the county, it's about 5 miles inland, runs down Empire Grade past the west entrance of UCSC, hits Western Drive, goes down Western Drive to Highway 1, and then follows Highway 1 south out of the county. If you're on the ocean side of that line, you're in the California Coastal Zone, and that means the California Coastal Act applies, and if you want to develop on your property, you need permission of the California Coastal Commission. The California Coastal Commission is really interesting. It's made up of 12 voting commissioners. They're political appointees. They often have backgrounds in things like real estate and law. There's lots of lawyers on there usually, and there's not always a biologist, although there is a biologist on the California Coastal Commission right now. Certainly there's staff who work for the commission that have backgrounds in ecology, biology, but not always on the commission itself. One of the things that the California Coastal Commission really cares about is protecting the coast. And they care in particular about what they call ecologically sensitive habitat areas. And one of the ecologically sensitive habitat areas that gets a lot of protection in the California coastal zone are wetlands. Wetlands in the coastal zone must meet what we call the one parameter test. So in order for a site to be considered a wetland in the California coastal zone, it needs to either have wetland plants, wetland soil, or wetland hydrology. Here on our site at the Terrace Lands, we have a number of wetlands. And when you have wetlands on your site, not only can you not build in them, but you also end up having to protect them. And so where you have wetlands and where you don't have wetlands is really important if you want to develop on your site. So thinking about these three parameters that one of those needs to be met for the one parameter test, I want to walk you through the plant, soil, and hydrology on the terrace lands. So terrace lands hydrology, there's historic evidence of ponding on our site. If you look at those aerial photos that I showed you earlier, going back to 1926, you can see areas that were wet that show ponds. Some of our former students have done interviews with landowners, and those landowners have talked about draining seasonal ponds to accommodate row crop production. Here's some photos again that show that. So here's the 26 aerial, and if you look sort of in the center of the white bounded area, you can see these places that look like depressions, and those are seasonal ponds, and those are places that were historically wet. The 1972 aerial shows not only those wet places, but interestingly, also these ditched areas where the farmers were trying to actively drain wetlands from the site. The terrace land soils, there's three different types of soils that are on our site, mapped soils types, and 2 out of those 3 types are listed on the NRCS hydric soils list. So that's a list of wetland soils. Now, you always have to go out and actually look at your soil in the field, but 2 out of the 3 mapped soil types, and this is a map showing where the different soils on the terrace are listed on that hydric soils list. So wetland soils, soils that are typically inundated with water, that are under low oxygen conditions and support wetland plants. And then getting to the terrace land plants. So most plants in the entire United States have been classified by the USDA about what their wetland status is. Basically from this plant almost always occurs in a wetland all the way to this plant almost never occurs in a wetland. There's a plant that grows on our site, Douglas's baccharis or Baccharis glutinosa. And at the time of the wetland delineation on our site, Baccharis glutinosa was listed as an obligate wetland species, that it almost always occurs in a wetland. The time of the delineation, this map shows in orange where Douglas's baccharis existed on the site. And you can see that most of the site had some of this wetland obligate plant. So if you go back to the idea that in order to meet the one parameter test for a wetland in the California coastal zone, that you need to have wetland soils, wetland hydrology, or wetland plants, boy, it seems like we might be meeting all 3 out here on the terrace lands, not just one. And if you have a wetland in the California coastal zone, remember that site can't be built on and it has to be protected. So this map here that shows the Douglas's baccharis also shows where the university had some early developments, but there was quite a bit of area that was open. In 1989, the farmer that owned the property that we now consider as the terrace lands was farming that land but could no longer pay the mortgage on the property. The bank that held the mortgage was Wells Fargo. Wells Fargo took the property back, and then Wells Fargo tried to do something to come up with an idea to develop that site. And there was lots of different ideas about what they might do out there. They might build a convention center, maybe a hotel, maybe some housing. They were not able to get the local folks to get online with that. And then the university purchased the property in 1999 and started the process of trying to figure out, could they do something to develop the site? And you can see that this was quite controversial. So this is our one of our campus papers, the Fish Wrap Live. The date on this is 1994. UCSC pushing for coastal development. UCSC and Wells Fargo plan to build on last coastal meadow in Santa Cruz. So our site has really been important locally. It's kind of considered to be the delineation between the more developed town and the more rural up coast. City utilities don't go beyond our site, and folks in town were like, hey, wait a minute, this was prime ag land, it's been sitting fallow, now it's a coastal meadow, and now Wells Fargo and UCSC want to develop on it, and it was quite controversial. Fast forward here, this is an archived article from the Metro Santa Cruz, again going back into the 90s, point of contention, the invisible shrinking plan. These are articles talking about the university's efforts to build an expanded coastal science campus on this site, the Terrace Lands. At the end of the day, what really drove where the university could build was where there were wetlands and where there were wetland buffers. So you can see this is the site that the university owns. It's about 100 acres. It includes a 25-acre original Younger Lagoon Reserve, all of the areas that were developed at the time the university purchased the land from Wells Fargo, and then the open space. And of what they purchased, which was 65 acres or so, about 47 of those were not going to be developable because they were either wetlands or wetland buffers. So wetlands are protected in the coastal zone, and then the wetland buffers are meant to provide extra protection because wetlands shrink and swell and dry in wet years, and then also just to give just a little more of a protection to them as well. You can see that of what the university purchased, from the bluffs all the way up to the railroad tracks, a lot of it was wetland habitat. And so it's kind of the opposite of you break it, you buy it. The university already owned this property, and now they were going to be obligated to care for it. So Younger Lagoon Reserve had been here since the 80s, the 25 acres on the left-hand side of the screen, the lagoon area. We had been cruising along with a small budget, fleets of interns, fleets of volunteers working on restoration on that site. The campus approached the UC Natural Reserve system about the possibility of incorporating the lands that couldn't be built on into Younger Lagoon Reserve as the Terrace Lands. The California Coastal Commission was pressuring the university to conduct long-term restoration, enhancement, and protection of the Terrace Land site. And so the campus approached the UC Natural Reserve system saying, would you like to incorporate this into the existing Younger Lagoon Reserve? And then it went through a process with our Natural Reserves Advisory Committee to see if we could, in fact, incorporate those lands. Typically, UC Natural Reserve sites don't do mitigation work. That's not really what we do. Most of our reserves are really protecting more intact natural lands, so this was a little bit outside of the norm. But ultimately, a plan was come to agreement on that would incorporate the 47 acres into the reserve as the Terrace Lands. This shot is a different way of sort of appreciating what might happen on our site over time. So this is the long-range development plan sort of illustrated build-out that was approved in 2009. So the buildings on the site that are in the gray are buildings that were existing at the time of approval. Red would be new buildings that would come on site. So you can see quite a few new buildings clustered outside of the area where the wetlands are. And then all of the green areas, all of the open space around that would be incorporated into Younger Lagoon Reserve. One of the important things that happened with the incorporation of the lands into Younger Lagoon Reserve was the campus and the reserve agreed that the reserve would conduct restoration on the site, and that restoration was going to be guided by a scientific advisory committee. So our scientific advisory committee is made up of 4 folks. Dr. Karen Hull, who's a professor in environmental studies and expert on restoration. Tim Highland, who is an ecologist that works for state parks. Brian Largay, who's a hydrologist, currently works for the Land Trust of Santa Cruz County, but has also worked for Elkhorn Slough Foundation. And then Dr. Lisa Stratton, who runs the Cheadle Center down at Santa Barbara, which is a similar program to our restoration program here at Younger Lagoon Reserve, although they have more property, more staff, and work on a larger scale. So this group of experts was brought in to help guide restoration at Younger Lagoon Reserve. One of the things that they really cared about, well, they cared about a number of things. So one of the things is that we would start by doing some baseline and reference site monitoring. So when you're going out and doing restoration work, you need to answer the question, well, what are we restoring to? Do we want to go back 10,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago, back to what the site looked like before the Portola expedition, after the Portola expedition? So trying to pick a point in time, and this is a choice that we make as restorationists, so being conscious about that choice. So we got permission to go out and survey a number of our botanically rich sites up and down the coast. And then graduate students, staff, and undergrads as well work to put together reference and baseline monitoring reports. So baseline monitoring means what was on our site at the Terrace Lands when we took them on, and reference site reports really helped us to define what might we actually be able to achieve with restoration on this site. What were some of the plant species that would be appropriate? What were some of the targets for restoration that might be appropriate? Our scientific advisory committee also really wanted success criteria. So we have a number of different success criteria for different habitat types. On coastal bluffs, we have a performance standard of 8 native plant species appropriate for the site and 40% cover. Grassland, again, 8 native plant species and 25% native cover. That really gets to the point that restoring grasslands is really difficult. In our scrub, 8 native species and 40% cover. Wetlands, 4 native species and 30% cover, except for wetland 1 or 2, which are a little different up in the upper terrace. And then in the wetland 1-2 complex, 3 native plant species and 30% cover. So giving us some defined criteria that we're going to try and meet to judge ourselves over time whether we're succeeding at restoration or not. And then also that we would be obligated to do monitoring and reporting. So every year, our staff and students go out and monitor restoration sites. We put those data together and we report back not only to the campus, but also to the California Coastal Commission on how we're doing with our restoration work. The results so far, we're meeting all of our restoration goals and meeting the success criteria, except for at a couple of our coastal prairie sites. So again, coastal prairie, we're trying to restore 8 native plant species and 25% cover. Coastal prairie is notoriously difficult to restore. Most of our sites are meeting our goals, but in a couple of our sites, especially in our 2012 plantings, we haven't been meeting our target. So we're working on restoring those and trying to beef those numbers up over time. But it's good to have these types of checks, to have some real data on what are you doing and how are you meeting the success criteria or not. Another thing that our scientific advisory committee really encouraged, and the same with our natural reserves advisory committee, is that we incorporate applied research into our restoration efforts. So most of the time, land managers have a small staff, a limited budget, and the idea of incorporating research into what they're doing is like this extra added headache that maybe they have the capacity to do, but oftentimes they don't. We're the university, and one of our core missions is research. And so we took it upon ourselves to incorporate research that was asking questions about best practices for restoration. So what are the best weed control techniques in our area? What types of planting techniques work? Should we use seeds? Should we use small seedlings? What different species do well on our site? And try to incorporate those into all of the work that we do. Students have been involved in all of that research. So we're students partnering with faculty, and we've had papers come out about some of those research projects. This is a picture of one of the research projects that was installed in 2010. So now it's 10 years old. It still exists on the site, and we still collect data on this project. And this was looking at different weed control techniques for restoration. Early on in our restoration work, one of the things that we really worked on was priority 1 weeds, and we continue to work on those every year. That was another thing our scientific advisory committee really encouraged us to think about. So we have different levels of priority for our weeds. So one of the levels is watch list weeds. So those are perhaps the most important. Those are weeds we don't have on our site yet, but that we know are in the area, and we're trying to look and see when they show up. We call it early detection, rapid response. And with everything that's happening right now with the COVID-19, it's kind of an apt comparison. If you have something coming into your area, you want to stop it early if you can before it really starts to spread out of control. Then after that, we have priority 1, 2, and 3 weeds. Priority 1 weeds on our site are usually things that are bigger weeds, so that actually makes them kind of easier in a way to work on. You can really go after them. Typically slower moving weeds and things that we have developed techniques to work on. So something like Cape Ivy in the top left of the screen, Jubata grass in the top right, or ice plant on the bottom of the screen. The bottom of the screen shows our coastal bluffs before we started working on the ice plant. You can see it just looks like 100% ice plant. And then after we started getting in and pulling the ice plant, you could see there was actually some native coastal scrub underneath that ice plant. Priority 2 and 3 weeds are often things that are somewhat ubiquitous at the reserve. They're not as necessarily impactful on native species, so they don't, like for example, you can see the Cape Ivy in the top left of the screen here. Very little is living under that Cape Ivy. It's basically completely outcompeting the natives and turning that into a monoculture of Cape Ivy. Priority 2 and 3 weeds often exist side by side with our natives, and it's not to say that they don't have an impact on the natives, but it's usually not to the point that the natives are completely killed by the priority 2 and 3 weeds. And priority 2 and 3 weeds are often things that are much harder to work on. Even though it looks daunting, that big Cape Ivy patch is actually workable because you can go in, there's not a lot of natives in there anyway, so you can use these sort of more like forceful techniques to go in and remove all of the priority 1 weed and then go back and revegetate. Much harder when you have non-native grass growing next to native grass, growing next to native wildflower, all in an area, and you're trying to target the non-native but keep the natives. Our restoration is taking place in 3 phases over 20 years. So you can see phase 1 we just completed a couple years ago, and that's shown in the red on this slide. We're in the midst of phase 2, which is shown in the blue, and then phase 3 will be our final phase. So these 3 phases are taking place over 20 years, so 2 7-year phases and 1 6-year phase to end it. And we'll be learning about more restoration all through this quarter.